Good morning, folks. Yes, that's on. Very definitely on. OK. Welcome. Was the party good last night? Good. I went to see Aladdin, which was fantastic. I know Scott Hanselman went to see it as well. I didn't see him there, but hopefully he had a good time as well. Before I get into my talk, just to notice, I'm sad again. I go to conferences, and I get very sad when I look at the gender diversity, or lack of it, in conference halls. Can I just remind everyone, it's our problem to fix. Okay? We should not be asking women and other underrepresented people to fix the problem themselves and go out and be women in tech at conferences. Strangely enough, the women in tech want to do the tech stuff as well. Right, rant over. OK, so today is the first time I've presented this talk, and it's the first time I have talked since taking on a new project at work. And this is basically the new project. This is partly, I'm sure my manager, or my product manager at least, would like me to be showing off how easy it now is to connect to Google Cloud Platform services with C#. That is a small aspect of today's talk. And I hope you do go away, and if you hadn't thought of looking at Google Cloud Platform, which I will call GCP after this because it's much simpler. If you hadn't looked at GCP before, have a look. Try the beta of the code that I'll be showing today. Please give us feedback. But that's not really the point. Okay, the point is, I've been writing C# professionally for a bit. Hurrah! And the context in which I'm writing code is fairly interesting in itself, and we've been having to make various design decisions which have not been easy. Wouldn't it be lovely if programming involved think, get the right answer, move on to next problem? It's clearly not that way. There are trade-offs all through. We'll be looking at some of those trade-offs, and basically I want you to think about how the same trade-offs may be relevant in your projects. Think about where you don't have to think about these decisions because you're in a simpler situation, or maybe you have to think about the same decisions but with completely different inputs. And if you've got different inputs, if you've got different stakeholders, then don't expect the same output. So this is in no way meant to be a guide for how to do things. If you go away and take all of our decision points and apply them in your own projects, that would be a bad thing. If you go away and think about all the design decisions we've made and how you might make them the same way or might make them differently, that's good. So a little bit about me. You probably, how many of you use Stack Overflow? Yeah, right. So you probably know me from that. Other community things, blogging, writing book. I'm also an armchair language designer. I'm fortunate enough to be the convener of the ECMA standardization committee for C#, which means I get to hang out with experts on C# and the C# language designers, which is great fun. But I'm not really a language designer. I can sort of nitpick holes in what other people have done. Now, I've been in Google for 8 years, and out of that 8 years, I've been working in Java mostly for 7 of them, but I've still been going to conferences and speaking about C#. And I've normally had to say, I am not speaking on behalf of Google, so please, anything I say that's stupid, assume that's just me and not Google. The latter bit is still true. So when I say stupid things, because it's bound to happen, assume that's me, not Google. But I am sort of speaking on behalf of Google today, because I get to talk about my work. For the last year, I have been on a team within Google whose basic mission is to make GCP better for .NET developers in all kinds of different ways. I happen to be working mostly in the client library side of things. And my mission, my personal mission, stated sort of informally, is if you're a C# developer looking for a cloud to build an application on, then I want to make GCP the most obvious, natural choice, because that's where you will succeed best. because we provide great C# support, and the services we provide support for are fantastic as well. From the opposite point of view, if you're a GCP developer, if you know that you want to be running on GCP in one of the various flavors, and you're thinking, which language should I use to code? Then I want to make it that C# is the obvious choice, because we all know it's a fabulous language, and when it's properly supported, and deployments are doddle, and debugging works end to end, and it's all lovely, that should just be the obvious choice for everyone. So all of that can be summed up as, I want to make GCP rock for C# developers. That is my mission. Now to take a little bit of a step back. I will try to use terminology consistently in this talk. When I say API, I mean a cloud service, so something that you talk to, such as Google Cloud Storage, or data store, or Stackdriver logging, something like that. So that's the API, which can be accessed from various different platforms, languages, etc. When I talk about a class library, that's a specific, usually C# for this talk, code that is running on your machine that will talk to the service sort of via the API. The only caveat to that is when I talk about API reference documentation, that's just class library documentation, but it's so commonly known as API reference docs that I'll stick that way. So, APIs in Google. Out of interest, how many of you have used APIs from Google? Yeah? From C#? A few? How's it been? It's been OK. OK, that's probably about as good as I could have expected. How many of you remember something called GData? Oh, just one. A couple. So there have been a few iterations of APIs in Google. There are probably various iterations that I'm not aware of. But GData is quite a long time ago. We then had quite a lot of REST APIs beyond GData, which all used the same sort of code generation and were aimed to be RESTful and very resource-oriented, and the client libraries were resource-oriented, but a bit of a pain to use, to be honest, relative to where we want to get to, let's say. You can definitely be successful with them, but it doesn't feel like sort of rowing a boat down a river with a gentle breeze on your face. It's more like sort of paddling a bit hard in a kayak. So Google Cloud Storage is still available as a REST API. Then the new hotness is what are called gRPC APIs. So they can be accessed via Google's RPC, new RPC protocol, which is not Google specific. So the G of gRPC, yes, is Google, at least as far as I'm aware. It could be general RPC. You can use it. It's open source. You can set up your own gRPC server. You can talk to it from entirely non-Google code. It's basically an RPC protocol, typically over HTTP2. It's one of these things where the protocol itself doesn't mandate HTTP2. It just so happens that it aligns really, really well with HTTP2, and I don't know any other transport that's actually used. So take from that what you will. Likewise, you don't have to use protocol buffers. How many of you are familiar with protocol buffers to some extent? OK, I'll talk about them a bit more later on. They're basically a serialization format that Google has used for many, many years. So you don't have to use Google's protocol buffers with gRPC, but every example I've ever seen does. So now more APIs are being exposed over gRPC, and when they're exposed via gRPC, they're also exposed as RESTful resources so that you can access them. And typically from JavaScript, you would access them as RESTful resources. So there's this sort of duality between do we want to be as RESTful as we can, but it's still accessed via RPC as well. So an example of this is Google Cloud PubSub, which is about what you'd expect. You create a topic, and then you or someone else creates a subscriber for that topic, a subscription. And when something publishes a message to the topic, the subscriber gets to see the message, and all the other subscribers for the same topic do as well. I will be using PubSub in some of the examples just because it's really, really easy to get to grips with. There aren't very many gRPC APIs at the moment, but more will be coming on stream. And in the spirit of open source, you can see the service definitions for these gRPC APIs. Everything's on GitHub, but we have at least 3 different organizations on GitHub. So if you go to github.com/Google APIs/Google APIs, then you'll find a bunch of Protobufs in there. Don't worry about remembering that. Come and ask me afterwards. I'll show you. I would show you now, but I don't think I've got any kind of network connection worth a damn. OK, so we do have CodeGen already for the RESTful APIs over HTTP 1.1. They work, and I'm still responsible for maintaining both the code generator for that and the sort of support library. One pattern you'll see here many times is CodeGen with support library that provides things that the generated code talks to. So they still work. We still support them. But we think we can do better, partly by looking at the patterns that we're using in API design to get a better semantic understanding of what these RPCs and what these resources actually mean. I will get to code fairly soon, I promise. So we're mostly going to be talking about the gRPC stuff today, because that's the new hotness, and that's where I've been spending most of my time. And obviously, in greenfield development, that's where you tend to be able to make design decisions. By the time you've got something that's been going for a few years, there aren't very many design decisions other than how few people can I break to get more people new goodness. So within here, the blue parts are code generation, or generated code. The orange bits are per API manually written code that's me and my team, and all of you, because, as I say, this is all open source. It's lovely being able to work in open source, because later on I can just bring up the code that I've been working on and show it to you all, and you can say, hey, I'd like to fix that, and say, right, send me a pull request. So the orange bits are per API things, and the green set over on the left are the support libraries. So Google.protobuf is the supports for protocol buffers, so the actual serialization part. grpc.core and Google APIs auth and Google APIs core are used by the gRPC layer. And Google API GAX, that GAX is Google API extensions, which is, I realize, somewhat tautologous in this situation. That provides things like support for extra call settings, for retries, for page streaming, which we'll look at in a little bit. The idea is you should relatively rarely, when using these APIs, you should relatively rarely need to do anything with the code on the left. It needs to be there, and you're likely to see Google.protobuf bits, because you'll get repeated fields that you want to add elements to. But most of the stuff on the left you don't need to care about. The middle part, gRPC services, most of the time I hope you won't need to care about. You will need to care about the Protobuf messages. You probably want to care about the pattern-aware, resource-oriented layer that we're generating. And if there is a handwritten abstraction over the top, then you will definitely want to care about that. OK. Probably relatively little of that makes sense until I show you an example. So let's skip to Visual Studio. So we're going to show you, I'll show you 3 ways of getting a subscription from PubSub. And this is the lowest level. So this is still using generated gRPC code. So I guess, in theory, you could do all of this without any code generation at all by manually poking bits down a socket. You definitely don't want to be doing that. But let's just show you the bits that are required for a single get subscription call. So a subscription knows its own resource name and the resource name for the topic that it's subscribed to. Nothing in the PubSub side of things actually matters for the purposes of this talk. You know, I'm only explaining enough to explain the examples. Obviously, if you want to know more about PubSub, come and talk to me afterwards. So we create some credentials. And the fact that this is 5 lines of code is slightly annoying. But boy, is it simpler than it used to be. This is finding the default application credentials from your context, which is if you are running on a dev machine, you will probably have downloaded the gcloud SDK and then run gcloud auth login or gcloud application default login, I think. We're sort of moving from one to the other. And if you're running on cloud platform in some form or other, so Compute Engine or App Engine Flex or Kubernetes, then it will use a metadata server to find out basically who your project is, and it will connect on behalf of your project to PubSub. So that's getting some credentials. We then create a channel, which is sort of a socket. It's not necessarily exactly one socket, because it will lazily connect, and it will reconnect if things drop. And in some situations, which I've never actually tried myself yet, it could use multiple sockets for load balancing and things. But mostly, you don't need to care. So we create a channel by saying where we're connecting to, as you can see, over HTTPS, and converting these credentials, which are generic Google credentials that could be used in the RESTful APIs as well, and we want gRPC channel credentials. So we want to have a call invoker. You never need to see this. When you're not looking at this low level, you will never need to see this call invoker business. Likewise, the marshallers. So I mentioned that Protobuf was sort of optional in gRPC. You need to tell gRPC when you're trying to serialize a request, then call to byte array on it. And when you're trying to deserialize a request, which, OK, it's not going to have to, then use this parser. And likewise for the response. So having set up serialization of request and response, we now work out there's a unary method. So a unary method is one that takes one input and gives one output. And it's to this Google PubSub v1 subscriber API. And it's the get subscription method. And it takes a request. Sorry, it takes the request marshaller and the response marshaller. So that sets up the method that we're going to call. Then we can create the request. And the request is fairly simple itself. This get subscription request just says, fetch the subscription with this resource name. Depending on time, I may talk more about resource names and resource IDs later on. We'll see where we get to. So this is an existing subscription. And then finally, after all of that, I can call the method asynchronously and await it. The null here is for, I can't remember. I was going to say it was the call options. Oh, no, that's the host. So you can override. Even though I would normally call into this channel, you can say, for this call, I want to call a different host. Pass in the request, get the response. And the response is, in this case, just a subscription. That's all a bit painful, I think you'd agree. You definitely don't want to be doing all of that work every time you make an API call. Let's have a look at the with the generated code for gRPC. So that was using, you could get away with that by using the generated Protobuf code for get subscription request and subscription. But other than that, just plain gRPC. You would never do that. If you wanted to use just the gRPC generated code, then it's slightly simpler. I haven't bothered with all the setup of the channel because that's exactly as it would have been before. But you can create a subscriber client, and the client has generated code that says, hey, I know that I'm going to be given a get subscription request, and I'm going to return a subscription as the response. So we can just await it, and we have a PubSub subscription. Good. Still slightly painful. You know, why am I having to create this get subscription request? It's all a bit annoying. So let me just switch back to the slide very briefly. What I've shown you so far is using just the Protobuf messages and grpc.core. And then the second example was using the gRPC services. And then when we use the actual wrapper library, i.e. the bit that I'm more responsible for. So I'm not on the gRPC team. So far, I've done the Protobuf stuff, but the gRPC team is responsible for the previous example you showed. Using the library that you can just download from NuGet, you can say, I want a subscriber client. Confusingly, this is not the subscriber client class that you just saw. I'll talk a little bit about naming later on. The good news is you're unlikely to get confused because the gRPC generated one is a nested class within subscriber, so it should stay out of your way. This is a top-level class. So just create me a subscriber client. Notice how there's nothing about channels, nothing about credentials. I assume that most of the time you want to use the default credentials. If you don't, you can pass in a channel here. It's a little bit of a pain if you just want to pass in a credential. I'm going to fix that. But basically, I just want a client. We then have this next line for the subscription name. If you remember the big long string here, this projects, Jon Skeet Uber project, subscriptions, demo subscription, that's quite big and hairy. We still need that, but we can use generated code to get the full name from the bits that we're likely to care about, which are the project ID and the subscription ID. So we're saying format subscription name, Jon Skeet Uber project, demo subscription. And then we just say, I would like the subscription, please. Nothing else. OK, so it's gone down from quite a lot of code, not just in terms of lines, but hairiness, to 4 lines, including a console.writeLine, which are reasonably straightforward. I don't personally like the fact that we have to do this, but we can talk about that later on. So any questions so far on what that abstraction looks like? I haven't shown you yet any handwritten layers over the top, because for PubSub, it's sufficiently simple that we have decided, having looked at it, that we probably don't need an extra layer over the top. For data store, which is another gRPC-enabled API now, we do have a layer over the top. I'll have a little. I'll show you that a little bit later. But do you get the general idea of what we're trying to do? OK. Back to slides. So what decisions have we had to make, even in what you've seen so far? We've found that there are various tensions in API design. This is not massively a surprise. It's not like I came into mid-2015 and thought API design's really easy, or library design is really easy. But it's been interesting to me to see exactly where the difficulties lie. And it's mostly several different flavors of the same kind of problem. which is that there's no one-size-fits-all. We've kind of concentrated on making you productive in 5 minutes. So the last example that you saw, you should be able to see that sample, copy-paste it, get going. It will probably take you longer to sign up for Google Cloud Platform and get an account and maybe download the G-Cloud SDK. That should take you longer than running the sample. And by the time you've done that once, when you use the next API, it should be just like that. But does that necessarily mean that it's going to be entirely useful for your real application? How many of you have seen great demos of some platform or API and then thought, I'm going to go and use that at home or other, at work, and then found, do you know what, it doesn't quite do what I want, and it turns out that it's been built for demos. It's remarkably easy to do, and maybe I'm just naive, but I don't think it's actually a cynical ploy on the part of tech companies. I think it's because when we've been trying to make API decisions, we've looked at fairly small examples, thinking, how does that look versus something else? And we haven't been building. My job is building a class library. It's not building an application that uses pub/sub in the real world in a hardened way, etc. And I haven't got time to do that for every API that I want to cover, which is a shame. It would be lovely if I did have the time to do that, but it does make it tricky. So we try to make something that is simple and not scary. You shouldn't look at anything within the samples and go, wow, that's hairy. There's no way I could come up with that for myself or modify it to do exactly what I want or understand it later on. It's got to be simple enough to look at for the simple situations, but also flexible enough for real-world use. So chances are, in a production app, if you were writing Pokemon Go and calling into the API, you may very well want to tweak the retry settings. Did I show any retry settings up there? Not at all. But they should be sufficiently discoverable, however that manifests itself, that when you need it, it's there. So part of that discovery is working out who our users are. And when we're talking about Google, we have a huge variety of users. You may well be in a simpler situation. Most companies, this is not bragging, but most companies are smaller than Google. I think that's a fairly simple statement. So you may well know your users better. If you're providing a service to them, you may well have a better feedback loop than we do. So you can judge how experienced they are. One thing that I found very interesting is trying to work out how much documentation someone is prepared to read. And have any of you done user studies for developers where you've shown someone a class library and given them an example and said, right, you now have a task to get a subscription or list the subscriptions for a topic or something like that. And have you done that? If you have users who are using your code, do it. It will scare the living daylights out of you. Right, I shall take this example, remove all the useful lines, and then say I don't know what's going on. Yeah, you removed all the useful lines. So how much documentation are they going to read? If you could get them to read for 1 minute what is the absolute most important thing that you want to tell them, beyond the people, what are they trying to do in terms of portability? We don't currently support Unity. There's a trade-off there in terms of the resources we could spend to support Unity for these APIs. And that's in terms of my class library. You can definitely call these APIs from Unity, probably with the HTTP 1.1 stuff. That's all fine. These particular class libraries, we don't support Unity right now. We don't support .NET Core this beta release. I'm hoping the next beta release we will. You know, how much does that matter to your users? Are we actually only talking about ASP.NET devs who are running servers maybe from Azure? You know, we're not proud. It's fine. You can call our stuff from Azure or from AWS. We'd like you to be calling it from GCP, from Compute Engine, but no, we're not going to stop you from calling it from wherever. What are they trying to accomplish, and what's going to be helpful, and what's going to really get in their way? Back to the user perspective, so that there are, I think it's worth distinguishing, when you make design decisions, think about the application they're trying to build, which is a hard thing, so it's not a soft skills business, and then think about the person who is using your code. And those are very, very different things. Aside from anything else, there could be 100 people all building the same application, some of whom are interns who are learning C# for the first time, and some of whom are industry veterans who've seen all of this before. How can you make a class library that works for both of them? Are some of them using the same APIs, so using PubSub, for example, also from Python and from Java and from Go and from PHP and Ruby, or some subset of that? So they would like consistency. They would like to see things that look kind of the same in every language. Versus other developers may be using PubSub and cloud storage, for example. So Scott Hanselman, in his talk yesterday, no, it was just before his talk, he was showing bits of Azure monitoring. And he was saying he had a queue, and when an image was uploaded into Azure storage, he would get something on a queue, and he would run something to run Pung Crush or whatever to compress the image, and then pop it into somewhere else. So the equivalent of that for GCP would be uploading to Google Cloud Storage, and then you have a PubSub queue, and then something notices, hey, I've got something to do, fetches from GCS, Cloud Storage, runs Pung Crush, uploads it to Google Cloud Storage. So we've got two APIs there. I believe that many of our users use multiple APIs. So if you're using multiple APIs from one language, you want those to be consistent with each other, and ideally idiomatic for the language that you're using. But someone else might be just using the one API from multiple languages, and they have kind of different, not requirements, but different desires. Let's talk briefly about documentation. I would show you, so let's just see whether internet is working. And I can show you the docs that we've got. How many people here publish, whether it's open source or for work, have some library that they publish documentation for? How happy are you with your documentation? Mediumly? Oh, fairly. Right. I'm never happy with documentation. So whether that's for Nodetime, the open source project that I write, or our class libraries here, do you know what? This isn't going to work. But there are, again, competing concerns. Do you want your Java documentation to look like JavaDoc, and then if you're using the same thing from Python, it looks completely different? Or do you want some sort of consistency between those two, even though at that point it's not fully idiomatic for either the Java user or the Python user? Okay? These are not obvious questions that can be answered with a yes/no answer. What TLDR do you provide? That sort of 1 minute, if you read nothing else, please read this. What level of conceptual documentation do you provide, and how high do you aim that? No one is going to read documentation, or very few people are going to read documentation and say, I'm not an advanced user, so if there's a simplified version, that's what I'll read. Everyone's going to say, no, I'm really smart. I will read the smart people's advanced documentation and quite possibly get lost. So how do you provide things that work for advanced and inexperienced users. What do you give as samples? I mentioned earlier on, I haven't built a full PubSub application. I did build a sample little chat application, which I gather now isn't really the aim of the PubSub API. But I haven't written a full application. But what kind of samples can we give? I have colleagues who are writing sample web applications that do use a variety of APIs. So that's kind of useful to see it all in a big context. But then to get the full benefit of that, you need to clone the repo and run it yourself, and then maybe step through relevant bits, tweak it a bit, versus here's a sample that's unrealistic. It does one thing. It says, I will list all the subscriptions in this project. OK, well, that's not terribly useful in itself, but it is good as if you know that you want to list the subscriptions, just seeing that one thing is great. The other thing that we've been exploring is what to do in terms of examples within an API reference. So I'll show you an example of this. How many of you have used docfx at all, or heard of it? No? OK, well, if nothing else, I can provide you value today by saying go explore docfx. I believe it's what's used for the ASP.NET Core documentation. It's from Microsoft. It's sort of, think of it as a successor to Sandcastle-ish. And it works with .NET Core projects. It works with CS projects. We've had to do a little bit of work ourselves to add a bit more flexibility. But basically, we wanted to provide examples within our reference documentation which we knew worked. If you write code within XML comments, it will fail. It's bound to. It's not refactoring proof. It's just not going to work. So we have a bunch of examples here. So let's, OK, these are written as tests. Some of them genuinely are tests in that they will assert things at the end. They will all run. They will all compile. So if I ran these now, they would fail because I've got no internet connection. But that's good, because it means that it proves they're trying to exercise something, and they're exercising something that would fail within this room. And then we've got the snippet here and end snippet. And that means I run a little tool. It extracts just that chunk of text and puts it somewhere else that can be extracted later on by another bit of the process, the pipeline. And so if you look at the list topics method within publisher client, you will see that example. OK? That's quite nice. In the future, because, hey, this is C# and we've got Roslyn, just showing that snippet isn't terribly useful. You want to know what using directives are used. So in the future, I'm hoping to take that snippet, take all the using directives at the top, create in memory a program that just contains that. See, it should compile. And then I can see which using directives are actually required, and then put all of those into the snippet as well. Things like this, using the good stuff that is coming in the .NET ecosystem, really can help us build better documentation. So I would encourage you to look at docfx and think about how you might use that. It's still sort of a bit previewish. The default template doesn't have the greatest styles in the world, for example. But really think about your documentation. It's one of those things that is very rarely anyone's top priority. If you can persuade your company to get someone whose sole mission in life is to make your documentation awesome, and this isn't sort of application documentation, this is if you're exposing an API, then your users will love you for it. OK, so on to sort of less soft things. Another design decision we had to make early on with protobufs as well, not just these client libraries, but we knew from the start that protocol buffers would be used within our client libraries. I have a Proto 2. We've recently moved from Proto 2 to Proto 3. And ages ago, as a 20% project, I had an open source project supporting Proto 2 for C#. And it was pretty much a port of the Java code with some C# idioms. And the Java code is all based on immutability. We love immutability within Google. How many of you are basically familiar with the benefits of immutability? Yeah. So we went a different way for Proto 3 because we looked at the simplicity for getting going versus long-term benefits, and we thought, do you know what? There aren't quite enough long-term benefits to justify it being a pain to get going. And frankly, it being a pain all the time, that it's an ongoing source of low-level friction. There are definite benefits, and maybe in future versions of C#, I gather that records are no longer part of C# 7. Come to my talk later on to find out more about C# 7. But it's highly likely that a future version of C# will have better support for immutability. But at the moment, it's just a bit of a pain. So we decided basic rewrite of our C# code for Proto 3, which is now no longer a 20% project. It's fully supported, part of the Google/Protobuf GitHub repo. It's full Google-supported code. And let's have a look. No, go away. I'll just show you the difference. So these are not quite the same protos because the underlying proto has changed. This is a sample proto for an address book, where an address book consists of people, and each person has an email and a name and also a mobile phone number, but I haven't shown that. So we get all of this annoyance. So just to build an address list to start with, an address book, we have to say, oh, create an address book builder, and then set some properties on it with an object initializer. And we can still do things. This is a collection initializer within it. I'm trying to use as much C# goodness as I can, but we've still got build all over the place. I could have added an implicit conversion from the builder to the non-builder, but that feels like that would be a step too far and would surprise people too often and would stop you from using var where you basically wanted to. So we have all of that. And suppose we wanted to set the ID for this single person. Well, we've got to convert it back to a builder and get the person that we've created and convert them to a builder as well, change their ID, rebuild it, set it back in the list, and then rebuild the whole address book. That's not fun. I don't like having to do this kind of code. In Proto 3, we have this. So obviously, you could squish this code up if you wanted to. But the main thing is no builders anywhere. And we just have a collection initializer. And when you want to mutate something, you just do. And this would make me sad for some scenarios because there are, again, definite benefits of immutability, thread safety, all kinds of stuff. But it makes me very happy that we can write something as simple as this. This was hotly debated within the team. I was personally resisting for quite a long time, partly because, and this is a lesson that I want to pass on, and it's not an easy lesson, we have biases. Okay? When you have written V1 of the code, and someone is suggesting a complete change of direction for V2, you will resist it, because that's human nature. We like what we've built, and I resisted for a long time. I think this was the right decision right now. As I said, when C# gets better support for immutability in later versions, we might make a different decision. Any questions on immutability before the next design point? Nope? OK. Page streaming. OK, this is one of the features that we support. I mentioned before that the generated code above the gRPC service layer is sort of pattern-oriented. So we have a style guide, which is either public or going to be public for gRPC for the services that we will expose. And one of the patterns that we have is if you're listing resources, such as subscriptions in a project, you may have thousands of subscriptions. We don't want to necessarily return all of those in one RPC. So we have a pattern where you do a list subscriptions request, and you can say how many items you want per page, and it will come back and say, here are that many items, or maybe a bit fewer, and here's a next page token. And then you can make another request and say, I would like to do the same kind of thing. I still want 10 per page. Here's the next page token. And you get back another page, and you keep going until the next page token is empty. A little bit like calling, in fact, very much like calling stream.read. You can detect when you've reached the end by there's no next page token. You don't actually have to make an RPC that returns no results. We've got one fewer RPC than you would make stream.read calls. But if you've asked for 10 results, you may get back 5 before the server may notice, I'm about to overflow your timeout, so I'll return you what I've got in the next page token, and you can continue if you want to. Does that sound like a fun API to use directly from your application code? The answer's no, OK? I'll show you what I mean. So, manual page streaming. OK, so it's not so bad. Okay, it's the kind of thing that if you do once, you don't mind too much. So this is just printing the subscription name and the topic name for each subscription in the project. And it's a do-while loop, and this is not terribly difficult. But it is, I won't say it's a page of code, because clearly I've got a massive font, but it's 15 lines of code. It's annoying. So we want to make that simpler for you. So in the generated layer above, we knew right from the start that we wanted to do this, we will just expose some sort of iterator, and you can just iterate over things, and we'll do this next page token stuff in the background for you. Great. So what design decisions does that throw up? The first one that I honestly actually now can't remember the answer to is, what do you do about a timeout? If you're saying list subscriptions, and you give me a timeout of 30 seconds, is that per request? Is it in order to get to the end? What is it? In our case, I believe we treat it as a per request. And because everything's lazy, this returns, let me show you the actual thing. The return value from list subscriptions here is lazy. So actually, calling list subscriptions does almost nothing. Out of interest, how many of you are surprised by that? A few. Come and talk to me later and say how we could make that more obvious. So from a link point of view, it shouldn't, if you've used link and used data tables or whatever, sorry, not data tables, but the tables you get from EF or link to SQL or whatever, it shouldn't feel surprising. But I can see that you're calling a method saying list subscriptions. It should do something, damn it. It's even worse with data store, where we have run query, which doesn't run a query. It gets ready to run a query as soon as you start iterating over the results. I'm fairly confident that it's the behavior we want, but for a while we called this list subscriptions page streaming. And it was pointed out that no one really wants that. No one wants the extra hassle. So this is one of those things that if I could tell developers like 5 small things, it would be, when you're doing a list, it's deferred evaluation. You're almost certainly not going to see the difference, because why would you call list subscriptions and then not use the result? But it does matter in that you don't want to call list subscriptions and then call count on the result and say, there are count suppose I did listing subscriptions.count, subscriptions. Okay? Then you may expect that to list them once. Sorry, just needs system link. You may expect that to list them once in terms of RPCs, and then display the count and display the data. But no, just as it would in link, link to SQL or whatever, that would run through everything to get the count, and then run through it all. It's preparing a query. It's not actually doing it. But beyond that, this feels kind of nice. I'm listing the subscriptions. Great. But that may not be the only use case. So if you just want all the subscriptions, that's fine. What if you're doing a web API, a web application, and you're trying to list the subscriptions, and you want to list them one page at a time? This doesn't help you at all, it seems, okay? Because you're trying to display the next 50. Well, we've no way of saying in what I've shown you so far, okay, just give me the first 50, and then I'll display the next 50 after that. And how do you display the next 50? Well, we do have a way of doing that. We still call list subscriptions. But then whereas the type of subscriptions, I'll just make it explicit here so that you can see it in a decent font. Come on. Ah, no. Sorry, I had to launch Visual Studio in safe mode because for some reason it crashes when it launches without a network. And it looks like the autocomplete to do explicit declaration doesn't work. But anyway, this is an I-paged enumerable of tResponse, tResource, where tResponse is a list subscriptions response, and the tResource is subscription. And that I-paged enumerable has an asPages method. And the idea is this basically gives you back, instead of a sequence of the subscriptions, it gives you back a sequence of the RPC responses. So it's still doing the page streaming for you. It's still providing value, but it's sort of a little bit lower level. And this way, you can look at the page tokens yourself, and that's kind of useful-ish. It's still not great for a web application. Anyone think why? If you're doing a web application, you probably want to display 10, 20 at a time. And if the API happens to give you back 5, you don't want to display a page of 5. You want to display the next 20. So this was another use case that we considered. And we can actually do, after doing asPages, we can currently do with fixed size, 10, whatever it is. And this will make sure, yeah, ignore the compiler as it changes the return type, obviously. At this point, there may be extra properties within each response that we no longer give you because we're doing extra work on your behalf. So it could be that one fixed page that we return you with 10 results came from 2 different responses. So we're not going to give you the response anymore, but you will get exactly 10 items until you reach the end of the list, obviously. And you will get a next page token that will let you get the next one. So that should work for web applications. So those are the use cases that we've come up with of, I want to see the responses, I want to just see the resources because I'm dumping them in a console app, or I'm doing some batch processing, or I want to get them with a fixed size. And it took us, it's taken me 5 minutes to explain it all. It took us a good few days of working out how do we want to expose that. We're still not sure, is it better to have asPages.withFixedSize, or should we just have subscriptions.asFixedSizePages? Aside from anything else, if we did this, we could get away with, I think, 2 fewer interfaces, which I don't care about having more interfaces in terms of my code maintainability. It's simple. But I don't want to pass that conceptual burden onto you folks. So there are reasons either way. OK, I'm running out of time. Do you know, I came this morning thinking, I do hope I've got enough material for an hour. Whenever I watch someone else's presentation, an hour feels like a long time, even if I'm having a great time. But it's amazing how things change when suddenly you're presenting. Right. So I will go back to the slides and work out which of the slides we should look at most. So naming, versioning, inheritance. Right. I can probably cover both quickly. So naming and versioning. When you download the PubSub NuGet package, that is called google.pubsub.v1. And the current version of it is v1 beta 1. Is that confusing? OK. Darn. It's still the right thing to do, I think, because the API version is Google PubSub v1. We may come up with a much better way of accessing it with all different code gen that is a completely breaking change. And that would be Google PubSub v1 version 2. Unfortunately, in theory, it wouldn't finish there, because we could be using different versions of the Protobuf code gen, different versions of the gRPC code gen. There are various orthogonal axes here for versioning. But we've decided that the client library version you get is separated from the API version that you're accessing. That's bad in terms of it's confusing. It's good in terms of flexibility. At some point, I'm sure there will be a Google PubSub v2. You don't want to automatically update to that from NuGet, because it may be breaking. It may have some different features. They may remove some features or rename bits and pieces. We've had an interesting discussion about what counts as a breaking change within an API. That seems like it should be obvious, and I mean an RPC API. It feels like it should be obvious, but it's really not. If I have an enumeration, I don't think there were any in PubSub, but in data store, for example, there are read options. And you could say, I would like my read to be read consistent, eventually consistent, or have a transaction. Well, what if they add a fourth one? Is that a breaking change or not? Like, well, if it's only something that the client's going to give, then it's fine to add stuff, because if you don't know that the option exists, it's not going to hurt you if it's added. If you're getting something back, then you might have a switch statement that will break if it doesn't see any of the options that it expected. In that particular case, we've decided that the backward compatibility requirements of making enums sort of a closed set is so limiting for API producers that, no, you as clients should always understand that there might be new values coming back. Deal with it. It's kind of a pain, but it's better than stifling the innovation on the server side. There are other things that obviously, if someone makes a typo in a field name and that's generated, if you had milliseconds instead of milliseconds, well, that's that until the next major version. We're not going to break people just because we made a typo. I mentioned inheritance. It may not be entirely obvious how inheritance maps onto this versioning thing, but one of the things you can do in a version 1.1 of PubSub would be, which would still be, so I should go back, google.pubsub.v1 would include anything v1.1, v1.2, etc., until we get to v2 or v2 beta 1 or whatever. So we're aligning on major version numbers of the API. So I've referred to publisher client and subscriber client various times. Sorry, I haven't realized I hadn't switched away. Right. Initially, we wanted to have iPublisher client and then an implementation of it. Yay! I love interfaces. They're great. They're mockable if you really want to mock, or we could provide you some fakes. All would be good. Unfortunately, it breaks. So suppose we have this IE cool API client with a look funky method. and then version 1.1 adds a new method. You can't add methods to interfaces. That's a breaking change. Because while we could provide you a fake, you may have written your own fake that implements the interface. I don't want version 1.1 of my client library to cause your applications to fail to compile. So interfaces are out. OK, what about abstract classes then? So we could create an abstract class with the methods, and that still breaks. For exactly the same reason. If we add a new abstract method to a public class, that is a breaking change. So the pattern that we have come up with, and this is largely to do with code gen, bear in mind that these are sort of examples of things that we're going to generate, and we don't want to have to look over every single change that's added to check that it's not breaking. We need to design for non-breakingness in the code generation. This is what we've ended up with. We have the base class, which is what you will all talk to, and that's what you should fake. And there's a static method on it to create an instance. And then there's the implementation. And the default behavior of any of these virtual methods, everything's virtual, and it all throws an exception. And then in the real implementation, it doesn't. You may ask, well, why not just have the implementation class? Well, because then you've got to have a gRPC client and a channel and all kinds of things that don't make sense for a fake. So I'm not sure. Has anyone seen this pattern before in other class libraries? No. That is a concern to me. I haven't either, by the way. This isn't that you're missing something. But when we've come up with a pattern that no one else has come up with before, that's always a concern. A, it means it's unfamiliar to you, so I need to explain it. And B, it means maybe there's something that we've missed. It may be too late to change this now if you think that this is a really bad idea. We have thought about it quite hard, but I would certainly rather know if you've got a better idea for something that wouldn't end up breaking if we add new methods, but is still testable, fakeable where necessary. That would be great. Right, I am now already 3 minutes over time. I have more stuff I would love to talk about. I will take 2 minutes for questions now, sort of wide open, and then obviously come and talk to me afterwards. Yeah?
Just wondering, why on the paging, why not use like take and skip and things like that?
So for the paging, why not use take and skip? You can absolutely use, if you call list subscriptions and then say skip 50, then we will make the API calls to fetch those 50 and then ignore them. And then, because it's just link, so it's just an IEnumerable, it will all work, but that makes RPC calls that you don't want. If you've got to page 1,000 and are getting the 10,000th subscription, you don't want to make all those API calls behind the scenes. I don't think it would be quite hard for us to intercept skip and take calls in order to do exactly the right thing. And the raw RPC APIs don't provide numeric access. You can't say, I want to skip to result 30. So we would have to work out, we've got to have a page token. We are limited by what the RPCs provide. And there are good reasons to not provide numeric access. I think some APIs do, but yeah, generally we don't. Any other general questions? Nope. Do come and talk to me if either you want to see the rest of my slides or want to ask something that you didn't want to ask publicly. Thank you very much.